Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today to review the results of our study on user behavior and the state of human risk today in 2021. And today we're going to be going over the results of our third annual user behavior study and survey. And this is something that Covered has done for some time to try to better understand human risk and how we can actually help people take action to reduce the risk they create for themselves and for their companies. So for those who aren't familiar with Covered, Covered Security is a human behavior management platform. For users, it's a personal assistant that motivates, facilitates, and rewards them for changing their behavior to reduce the risk online to themselves and their employer. And for employers, it's an analytics platform that lets them identify where risk and where risk isn't around human behavior, target people for changing their behavior with promotions and rewards, and then see how behavior changed to actually measure the behavior risk. So as I said, today we're here to talk about the results of our third annual user behavior study. And there were some very interesting findings. So why don't we jump right into it? So we all know that users' behavior causes risk. We see it in the analytics and the data, right? Fraud attempts are up over 20%. Non-malicious insider security events are up nearly 17%, according to the Ponemon Institute. Social engineering attacks are up, account takeovers increased 20%. The data is clear. Users' behavior causes risk. We also see this in the targeting of users, right? While users are caught in a particular phishing simulation test at about a rate of 4%, they're so inundated with phishing email from hackers throughout the year that 22% will fall prey to phishing at least once during the year. Google has reported that phishing domains are up almost 25%. We see from Akamai the ever-increasing deluge of credential stuffing attempts, up over 70% in 2021 to over 300 million credential stuffing attempts every single day. And then finally, we see this in the impact of all of this activity and risk on organizations and fraud costs, which for the first time topped $50 billion in the United States last year. In the valuation falling for public companies after they've had breaches, we see it in the fact that non-malicious insider behavior now costs the average company about $7 million. Well, what we try to figure out through the user behavior survey is how and why. How is this happening and why is it happening? And we look across three areas. The first is the user's experience with security and hacking. And experience at work is only about half of that. Secondly, we take a look at their attitude. This is important because we know we have to build a culture of security. We need them to be part of the defensive team. And finally, of course, we ask directly about behavior. Not if they can identify the right thing to do, but the question is, what do they do when they're presented with a choice? And because of the breadth of this, we actually split this up into multiple surveys. And we do this because, of course, no one's going to sit through an extremely long survey to understand each one of these areas. So we conduct multiple surveys throughout the year across 500 to 1,000 Americans, and this leads to a margin of error that gives us faith in the results that we get strong results back. Now, the questions that we want to answer through this process, through the survey and study, first and foremost is training working? We're putting a lot of money into training and security awareness. Is it actually having impact? Second, what are the key behavioral issues that we should be focused on? And thirdly, how is that behavior trending? Fourth, what are the users' attitudes towards security? How do they think about it? How do they view it? Is it important to them? And then finally, what about their behavior at home? Now that we're having an awful lot more of work from home, how is this impacting the risk? And all of this leads to the biggest question that we hope to answer through the survey and the study, which is, how can we actually bring about changed behavior to reduce the risk to the individuals and to the organizations that they're connected with, like their employers. So the first area that we focus on is training. And we've done a lot more training over the past few years. The real question is it working? Well, on the surface, it appears to be moving in the right direction. We've seen a steady increase in training at work. Now nearly 90% of users get training about security at work. And depending on whose figures you look at, spending on security awareness and training will increase 25 to 40% annually moving forward. Perhaps surprisingly, when we ask users, did they act on the recommendations from all of this training, over 60% said that they had taken actions on a training recommendation. All good news. But when we look deeper, we begin to see cracks form in this narrative. Only a minority of users report that they find security training to be effective, less than 40%, 36.7% actually. Calling into question just how valuable those actions are that 60% of them claim to take after training. And when we look further, we find out that users, they don't feel motivated by training to take action. Again, calling into question that 60% that claim to take action. 38.8% of users surveyed said that they actually found training motivating them to want to take action. And these views aren't new. They've been with us year after year. There really has been no perceptible move in the user's view of security training, even with all the investment in videos, investment in making training more entertaining and gamified. When we look at training as a motivator, perhaps we see a little bit of change. We see the report of behavior of effectiveness pulling in from the edges, with fewer viewing it as very effective or not effective at all. But really, overall, there's little change. And we have to admit that we're either not moving forward or we may actually be regressing. In 2018 and 2019, we saw users' self-reported understanding of cybersecurity technology and practices nearly follow a traditional bell curve, with a positive weighting towards a stronger understanding of cybersecurity technology and practices. Well, as you can see from this analytic, this changed dramatically in 2020, with a substantial skew towards users believing they had a weaker understanding of security technologies and practices. We can see, frankly, that in every positive part of this diagram, the 2020 results are lower than the prior 2 years. And as we move towards weakness, it is higher or much higher than 2018 and 2019 survey results. We haven't been able to determine exactly why this is the case, but this is a statistically significant change. Perhaps the hacker onslaught is beginning to take its toll. Well, let's move on to behavior. And the spoiler alert, perhaps not surprising, is that behavior isn't good, and it's not necessarily getting any better. There are a few bright spots, but overall, we're just not seeing the progress we need as hackers intensify their focus on individuals. Now, where we look for behavior is really important. The question is, what behaviors should we actually examine? There are many user behaviors that we in the security profession view as deficient. But what are the key behaviors that we should be concerned about? We only get so much mind share, so many opportunities to communicate with and train end users. We need to choose wisely. Covered's research of behavior and online compromise provides the framework for our survey. Our research shows that security professionals are far less likely to suffer online compromise than typical end users. We studied the behavior of thousands of users, both security professionals and otherwise, across nearly 200 behaviors. Using machine learning, Covered found that security professionals' lower rate of compromise was the result of 18 very specific areas in which their behavior differed from the typical end user. Now, this rate is 56% lower than the rate of compromise of the typical end user. Now, I want to be clear, not every security professional employs all 18 behaviors, but as a class of users, they are much more likely to do so than typical end users. These 18 behaviors are the result of 4 meta habits. The first being, we're skeptical. If something looks too good to be true, we know that it's too good to be true. We typically look not for confirmation, but we look for problems. The second meta habit is an understanding and an adjustment to hackers' changing strategies. We recognize that they're getting more sophisticated. We recognize that they take multiple steps to attack us, like hacking one site for information to use it to attack us on another site. Third, we have an understanding that prevention is only part of an effective security approach, which should include detection and response as well. And then finally, the final meta security habit is we make decisions about security based on risk, the combination of the likelihood of an event and its potential impact. Now, as we mentioned, these meta habits were visible in 18 specific behaviors that security professionals as a class typically exhibit, and typical end users as a class typically don't. And that reduced the likelihood that hackers would succeed in the 5 major ways that they try to compromise us: via social engineering, phishing, password cracking, credential stuffing, and account takeover. So let's look across those 5 areas and the results that we saw in the study. Well, relative to social engineering, the risk factors show it's really a mixed bag. One of the behaviors that covers machine learning analysis showed differentiated security professionals from others was how they treat their information on social media. The results show that a majority of people actually do behave like security engineers and constrain the visibility to their personal information. But we have a persistent 10 to 15% of individuals that continue to leave their information visible to all on social media, leading to opportunity for social engineering. When we look further, it's troubling to see that even now, over 25% of end users will choose mother's maiden name for an answer to a secret question, for actions such as password reset or account recovery, even though we all know that mother's maiden name is easily discovered. Interestingly, security professionals are more apt to lie in these situations when asked for an answer to a secret question. I guess this shouldn't be all that surprising, as we make risk-based decisions, and we know the risk of giving our mother's maiden name or the color of our first car is high because the availability of the data or because of the small answer set of the question. So we will lie more often. The good news, I guess, is that end users are beginning to lie as well, as we can see that the percentage of people who give a truthful answer all the time to security questions has fallen from 60% to just over 40%. So there's some good news and there's some bad news around social engineering. With respect to phishing, which has received the lion's share of training investment, we still face, again, a persistent small percentage of people who will just click on links and attachments. 6% in our 2020 survey. Even if they don't know the sender well, they will click the link. And we see there's another 16% where people will examine the email and then click on the link, even if it's been sent from someone they don't know well. Our survey shows the percentage is increasing, going from under 2% just clicking on the link or attachment to nearly 6%. Though we have to admit that the increase isn't statistically significant. But any way we look at it, the problem remains. Now, the area in which user behavior is perhaps the strongest relative to the best habits is in password cracking. The key behavior is the construction of the password and specifically making it a long passphrase, something that the industry has increasingly emphasized over the past few years. Over 90% of users report using a long password, 12 to 16 characters in length. Good news. Well, let's move on to credential stuffing, which unfortunately is the counterweight to that good news. Habits related to credential stuffing are another matter, unfortunately. When we look at the data, it's no wonder that is becoming a favorite tactic of hackers, rivaling phishing. And the trend is going in the wrong direction. A 2020 survey shows that nearly 23% of users use the same password for all or a majority of their accounts. We also saw that nearly 50% sometimes or always use the same password at work and at home. When we look at behavior around account takeover risk, we see why the rate of account takeovers has been growing. Security professionals understand the value of detective controls to catch that our account has been taken over quickly to limit the damage. While the vast majority of users exhibit good behavior, they use detective notifications for key accounts at a rate of over 80%. But again, there is a persistent 10 to 15% of the typical end user population that shows it doesn't understand this key habit because it doesn't use notifications for changes to their profile, which can lead to social engineering and account takeover, or changes, transactions, notifications for transactions that it might not have driven. They don't set up the notifications on key accounts that will help limit their damage. And I do want to stress that when we say there's this persistent 10 to 15%, it's not the same 10 to 15%. Overall, we see 70 to 80% of the individuals have significant behavioral risks across all of these 18 characteristics. Now let's look at account takeover. It is an emerging crisis. We see it increasing dramatically year after year over the past couple of years. Security professionals understand that hackers are patient, they collaborate, they're willing to use information hacked from one site to break into identity on another site. They know that when companies are breached, the companies often don't know whose info was involved or what info was compromised for several months. Actually, our data shows that over 60% of companies breached don't understand the full extent of damage for at least 12 months. So security professionals generally watch for breaches, and when one happens to a company where they have an account, they take action, like changing their password immediately. Whether they're contacted by the vendor that has our info or not, we change our password. Well, we can see here that less than half of end users report that they immediately change their password. And in fact, over a quarter don't change it all or wait quite a long time to change it. And we can see over time that this hasn't gotten any better. In fact, it looks like it's getting a bit worse. The percentage of people who never or eventually change their password after a breach started at about 22% in 2018 and is now up to 28%, a close to being a statistically significant increase. Well, that's the situation behavior, and it doesn't look too good. Well, let's see what attitude tells us. When we started to take a look at the attitudes of the individuals. And we would characterize this by going back to one of the United States' most successful movies, The Godfather. In The Godfather, there's a scene where Michael Corleone is talking to his brother about avenging the attempted assassination of their father. And his older brother chides him, saying, "You're taking this way too personally. This isn't personal, it's business." Well, in terms of user security, it's actually the opposite. It's not business, it's personal. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, when we take a look at the data, when we asked end users if they were concerned that their behavior could cause a security issue which would affect them, a vast majority were concerned, with 50% moderately to extremely concerned. Well, that's good. When we asked them if they were concerned that their actions would impact their employer, however, we saw that over 50% said they weren't concerned about that at all. It's clear they care about cybersecurity impact on them and not your organization. And when we look at their experience, it's no wonder. 100% of them, yes, 100% of those surveyed had been impacted by online fraud or a breach in the past 2 years. Over 62% of users were impacted by at least one instance of fraud. Over 64% by at least one breach. And the rates have been remarkably consistent over the past 3 years, with the exception of Account Takeover being substantially less in 2018, but having jumped in 2019 and remained steady in 2020. Users are very concerned. A majority of them consistently report that they have a high or very high concern about identity theft and privacy, 60 to 70% generally. Although not statistically significant, it appears that there's an increasing percentage of people that hold these views. And when you ask them if their level of concern is increasing, a majority responded that their concern about both identity theft and privacy is growing. And it's important to note that less than 10% report that it's decreasing. So users care a lot about privacy and security. They're concerned that their online behavior might come back to haunt them. So even if it's personal, if it's not about business, if it's not about their employer, is this something you can use for the enterprise? Well, the answer appears to be yes. We asked users what company in their life do they trust most to help them with their personal security, to avoid being hacked and reduce their concern. We asked about this for financial institutions, their cell phone providers, social media providers, key players like Amazon, Google, and more. And the results show the opportunity for the enterprise security team. One's employer is the third most trusted company in their lives. And as the trending shows, trust in one's employer to help with personal security is increasing significantly, just as the trust in organizations like Google has been decreasing. This could be because the line between work and personal has never been as blurred as it is today. After the pandemic made work from home a necessity for many businesses and accelerated a trend that we have seen was already underway. But while work from home may make users more open to personal security assistance from their employer in a way that protects the employer better as well, it's also increasing risk. Some organizations send users home with a corporate laptop and leverage virtualization, VPNs, adaptive authentication, and other technologies to secure work from home. But many don't have the resources to do this. And our survey shows, and this is really important, that even those that give users a corporate laptop to use at home, even those companies are at risk. Over 32% of users do work on their personal computer, even though they've been issued a corporate device. We also know that nearly 15% always use the same password at work and at home. Even easier to justify to yourself as you're sitting at home doing work, perhaps toggling between work and personal work. And of course, as we've seen, many more are concerned about how their behavior will impact them rather than the company. Work from home may be a necessity during the pandemic, and it may provide flexibility and cost savings after the pandemic. But one thing is for sure, It's opened up a wider attack surface for hackers. So with all of this look and this data around training and behavior and attitude and how we behave at home as well as at work, what are the takeaways that we have from the 2020 survey and study? Well, first, security training is helping, but it's not yet delivering significant and lasting enough behavioral change to keep up with the onslaught from hackers. And we see this because as the attacks have increased, the user behavior in our studies has shown little or no improvement over the past 2 years. But users actually do care. And that's something that we can leverage. Yes, they care a lot more about impact to themselves than they care about their employer. But combining this with them trusting key companies in their lives, like their employer, shows us a path to where we can help them achieve behavior change, changing their habits to reduce the risk to themselves, their families, and you, their employers. The keys to changing user behavior that we've seen from our survey, which provided very interesting insight into how to motivate security, moving from security awareness to lasting behavior change, are the following. First, personalize the impact. We've talked about it. We've seen the data. They care greatly about impact to themselves. They worry greatly about their privacy and about identity theft. Let's leverage them. We should also personalize the risk, not just show them that it could impact them, but make sure they understand it's a probability that it will impact them, not just a probability that it will impact the company. Third, we have an opportunity to train them at home in the context of their personal life, now that they're working more at home, where it will have greater impact to change their behaviors. And then the final thing is a reminder that we have to teach them about more than actions. We have to teach them to change their behavior. To get the complete results of Covered's user behavior study in the state of human risk in 2021, just send an email to info@coveredsecurity.com asking for a copy. We'll send it right back to you. And you can see the entire results from soup to nuts. And if you want to learn more about the 18 behavioral indicators that users are acting like security professionals, or how to measure user behavior risk, how to motivate them to change behavior and then measure that behavior change, just visit coveredsecurity.com and you can see a process grounded in behavioral science and cognitive science that shows how to drive that change. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope that you've learned something as we've gone through our 2020 user behavior study to show where the risks aren't around user behavior to the enterprise. Now I'd like to move on to questions. I'm sorry I didn't mention earlier, but please feel free to use the chat to ask a question of me, the presenter. Let's see if we might get some here. Okay, I think we've got one. Let's see if we get some more. The first question, or it seems like a little bit more like a comment. The 18 habits seem like an awful lot to get people to change. So I want to be clear about this. Those 18 habits in our analysis were not employed by all security professionals. As a class, we were much more likely to employ those particular behaviors. But each individual security professional did not use all 18. And that's really important. We don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the mind share to drive all 18 habits out to individuals. We need to focus on the areas where their behavior creates the most risk and focus on those habits alone? So that's a really good question. Got another question here. I get the value of maintaining privacy on Facebook posts, but I wonder if that really is such an important behavior. So again, our machine learning analysis showed that it was directly connected to security professionals' behavior and the difference of their behavior and the typical end user. I do want to stress again that really these individual behaviors are really indicators of those 4 meta behaviors. We have to teach people to think like security professionals, and then they're going to start behaving differently. They've got to, as we talked about, they've got to be skeptical. They've got to understand that there's detection and response that's just as important. They've got to understand that hackers hack one place to get information to hack elsewhere. And then finally, we've got to teach them to make a risk-based decision. All right, so is the password reset question a mother's maiden name, is that the end all be all to indicate that someone is high risk? Well, again, our data shows that it is connected to that because they're not making that risk-based decision. They're not thinking about, well, wait a second, my mother's maiden name is pretty well known. This shouldn't be used for me to change my password. So again, we want them to really adopt those 4 meta habits. And the way to do that is focus on these behavioral indicators. So it looks like we're coming to an end here. I apologize, we're a little bit over. We've got one final question, and let me just answer that. It's a long one. It's great to understand the key behaviors and know that we should use personal impact to motivate them, but how can we actually fit this into our operations? Okay, so this won't be a long answer for this. And thank you for asking this. Great segue for me. So again, Covered is focused on driving user behavior change. We need to use just-in-time methods. We need to engage people in the context of their daily lives, whether it's at work or at home, because our research has shown that people are 10 times more likely to take an action on a prompt around education if it's connected to something that they're actually doing at the time. So these sort of methods can be delivered to folks through a platform, a behavior management platform like Covered. So my answer for you is, how can you fit it into your operations? Just visit coveredsecurity.com, take a look at how we do that, and we're certainly happy to set up a 10-minute demo where you can see it in action. So again, with that, thank you very much for joining us. Greatly appreciate your joining us today and learning more about user behavior and where the indicators are for how we can drive progress. And we know that this will be a continuous battle with hackers, but we hope that we can earn an opportunity to help you and partner with you to reduce the risk that users' behavior creates for your organizations. So have a great day. Thank you very much. And let's keep everybody safe out there. Take care.
To learn more about how Covered Security can help you understand the risk end user behavior creates for your organization, motivate and reward them for changing their behavior, and measure the resulting behavior change, visit coveredsecurity.com.